Good morning, everyone. I will wait a few more moments and then get started with our introductions. All right, and I'll first turn to our court reporter, Ms. Cott. Are you ready for us to go back on the record?
Good morning, I am ready.
Great, thank you very much. I will start with introductions. Good morning. It is February 6th, 2025, and at least where I am, it is raining. And I'm Nicole Kinsey, presiding hearing officer for the Administrative Hearings Office of the State Water Resources Control Board. This is the hearing on the pending petition for assignment of state filed application 25517 and accompanying water right application 25517X01 and the pending request for release from priority of state filed applications 25513, 25514, the unassigned portion of 25517, 22235, 23780, and 23781 in favor of water right application 25517X01 of Sites Project Authority. Today is the second day of the phase of the hearing that will address the incidental take permit issued by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife for the proposed Sites Reservoir project. I should say permits, there are two. This hearing is being conducted by Zoom teleconference and is also being broadcast live on the AHO YouTube channel. If both the audio and the video of this hearing are being recorded, and we will post files of this recording to the FTP folder for this proceeding, and the YouTube recording will be available on the AHO YouTube webpage. If at any time you're experiencing technical difficulties, please email us. Staff is standing by and can let me know. And once again, Ms. Mullen is with us to handle the screen sharing of exhibits and moving slides along. So if you're a witness, you may please directly ask Ms. Mullen to advance your slides, or you may ask Ms. Mullen to bring up a particular exhibit. We will take breaks today, as has been our practice. We will have a mid-morning break and then lunch. We will have a hard stop at 5 p.m. If I recall correctly, there was a very polite ask from, I think, Mr. Busher about our lunch break, and so I'm going to ask you to remind me of the timing on that, and if that was today or tomorrow. I think it was today, and I will make a note of that. I'm not going to call for appearances. I will carry them over from Monday, but I will look to the room to ask if there's anyone joining us today who did not have the opportunity to introduce themselves on Monday. Do we have anyone new joining us?
Well, Ms. Kinsey, I'm not new, but I am going to introduce someone new to you.
Great.
Unfortunately, life has come up, and I've got to attend to some personal matters over the next couple of days. And so my colleague Kaylee Minton has graciously been willing to stand in for DWR and represent DWR over the next couple of days as necessary. So with that, I'm going to be out, but Kaylee Minton is the person who will be representing DWR.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Soderlund, and best wishes for taking care of what you need to take care of. And welcome, Ms. Minton, to our group today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Looking, and I see your hand is up, Mr. King, but looking to the rest of the room, is there anyone else to be new who has joined us today who needs to introduce themselves and did not have a chance on Monday? And with that, I will turn to any procedural matters. We can start with Mr. King.
Yes, Presiding Officer Kinsey. I wanted to see if you've received the email from Mr. Onbaum regarding the allocation of his 45 minutes to me.
I did see that, and I think we'll play it on a case-by-case basis. We don't have that many witnesses left in this phase of the hearing anyway, but of course we want to move along expeditiously with respect to cross-examination, but I certainly will keep that in mind that Mr. Ornbaum is not planning on using his time.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And with that, I will just give the update that we did receive rebuttal exhibits from a number of the parties yesterday. My understanding is that our team has moved those exhibits over yesterday and this morning to the FTP site where they are available to all of you. If you don't see your party's exhibits there, it's because we missed them, or for some reason they didn't upload properly. So I do encourage you, when you have a moment, to check and make sure the party you're representing, that those exhibits have been moved over and that you see them there. And also you will be able to see everyone else's exhibits. My intent would be to talk about any procedural issues related to the rebuttal phase of the hearing after lunch, so that we can use the lunch break, among other things, to take a look at what has been uploaded. I have not had a chance to look through everything, and I think it would be helpful for us to do that. So my intent is to hold a further discussion on rebuttal until after lunch, and then go from there. But with that, before we resume with cross-examination of panel 3, which I believe is where we left off on Monday, are there any other procedural issues we should address before we get started? All right, so as I recall, Mr. Busher was cross-examining panel 3 when we got to our 5 p.m. cutoff on Monday. I will look. There's Mr. Busher. Mr. Busher, does that fit your memory of where we were?
Yeah, I just have a few questions left for Dr. Greenwood.
All right, so our panel 3 is Mr. Whittington, Dr. Greenwood, and Dr. Wilder. It sounds like you just have questions for Dr. Greenwood at this time. And then, Mr. Busher, before we get started, will you remind me about the lunch break?
12:30 to 1:15, and thank you.
And that was today, right?
Yes.
Great. I think we can accommodate that. We may take a slightly longer break. We're on track, and then that would also give everyone a little bit longer to take a look at the exhibits we received, so that might be helpful anyway. So I will keep that in mind. And we have Mr. Ferguson, so it looks like we are ready to resume. Over to you, Mr. Busher.
Thank you. Good morning again, Dr. Greenwood. Thank you again for being here. I've just got a few questions left for you, and then I think I'll be done. If we could pull up Dr. Greenwood's written testimony, it cites 312, please.
Excuse me, Hearing Officer Kenzie.
Yes.
Andy Hitchings here. I'm actually kind of taking primary responsibility for Dr. Greenwood and Dr. Wilder. So,
Great.
Okay.
Our team fixed it.
Yeah, they are very
Thank
quick.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you for letting us know.
And if we could go to page 5, paragraph 8 of the testimony. Thank you very much. Dr. Greenwood, paragraph 8 discusses several of the conditions of approval from or contained in the incidental take permit related to salmonids. In your opinion, are the conditions of approval discussed in that paragraph necessary to avoid unreasonable harm to endangered salmonids?
I would say that they function to avoid or minimize unnecessary harm.
And so are they necessary to avoid unreasonable harm?
Well, these aren't the same as, for example, in the ITP application, which I'd analyzed and included in my prior testimony, which I also felt provided reasonable protection. So these are different than those, but I think these serve to also provide reasonable protection based on my review.
So I appreciate that. And where we started Monday was that I think your testimony was that the conditions of approval in the final ITP are more restrictive than the conditions of approval that you had previously analyzed in that application. And so my question is, for the conditions of approval in paragraph 8, are those necessary in your opinion, to avoid unreasonable harm to endangered salmonids?
These function, I think, to um, avoid or minimize unreasonable harm or provide reasonable protection. I think relative, as I mentioned, to the ITP application, there are perhaps other ways of doing so. For example, with what was proposed under the ITP application. So that's what I would say on that.
So I appreciate that you've said that they function to attempt to avoid unnecessary or unreasonable harm, right? That's not the question I'm asking, right? I want to know if you think these are necessary to avoid unreasonable harm, given that they are more restrictive than the conditions in the application.
I mean, these in their specific form may not be absolutely necessary in this form, given that they do differ from what was in the ITP application.
And when you say in this form, in that difference,
well,
that's the more restrictive condition?
Generally more, based on what I've reviewed and what I indicated on Monday in response to questions, they appear generally more restrictive. And so relative to the ITP application.
And is it your opinion then that these additional, more restrictive, or I'm sorry, is it your opinion that these more restrictive conditions relative to the ITP application are not necessary to avoid unreasonable harm to endangered salmonids?
I given that I was, my prior testimony was considering reasonable protection was provided with the criteria in the ITP application, then these aren't necessarily required to avoid unreasonable effects. I think, as we had discussed a bit on Monday, the ITP in striving to avoid and minimize potential effects such as take to these state listed species, then they may be requiring additional restrictions relative to essentially minimizing take, which may just be, for example, low numbers of individuals, like individual fish. I think in thinking
But in your opinion, sorry.
I think in thinking about reasonable protection, there may be differences in criteria, for example, slightly more or less restrictive in contrasting what we see here versus in the ITP application, but that would still achieve reasonable protection.
Do you have a different answer for the conditions related and your analysis related to either delta smelt and longfin smelt or to sturgeon? And those are in paragraphs 18 and 22 if you want to look at them.
Generally speaking, I wouldn't say my answer would be different. I think the nature of the conditions here is there are more specific ones, I would say, for salmonids, which we're looking at examples of, given the potential for near field type effects. I mean, it would apply to some degree to sturgeon as well, but so circling back on the basic question, I think it would be essentially a similar answer.
We look at paragraph 12 on page 7, please. Dr. Greenwood, paragraph 12 describes condition of approval 10 related to acquisition of land or acquisition and management of land for habitat for salmonids. Do you believe, is it your opinion that condition of approval 10 is necessary to avoid unreasonable impacts on endangered salmonids?
I think this one is an example of one where this mitigation was really only required for the full mitigation under the ITP. It wasn't something that was part of the, for example, EIR conclusions. So again, it's getting at that sort of CISA standard for full mitigation. So it's one where it's, as far as necessary for avoiding unreasonable effects, I think it's not necessarily the case.
It's not the case that the acquisition of the habitat described here is necessary to avoid unreasonable effects?
That's right.
I don't have any further questions for Dr. Goodman.
Thank you, Mr. Busher. Does this conclude your cross-exam, just to confirm, of this panel?
A panel, yeah, 3, I think we're on. Yes.
Thank you. And then I will look to the other NGO coordinating parties. Particularly, my understanding, if I remember right, is Mr. Schutz had a chance to cross-examine this panel. I don't believe Mr. Mooney had an opportunity. Is that right? Is my memory serving correctly? Mr. Mooney, do you have questions for this panel?
No, I do not.
Okay. Is there anyone else from the NGO coordinating parties who has questions for this panel? And then do we have any tribal representatives with questions for this panel? Then with that, I will turn to Mr. Reese. Do you have questions for this panel?
I do have a few questions. Thank you.
Please go ahead.
I think they're all directed at Mr. Whittington. But anyway, good morning. Mr. Whittington, yes, it's directed at you. Paragraph 16 of your testimony, if we could look at that, which is cites 306C. I think it's on page 12. Thank you. Yes. You say that the project shows an increase in long-term south of Delta exports of 96,000 acre feet, which is 2% in the final EIR, and then 121,000 acre feet, which is 2.5%, you say, in the ITP modeling. And I think I understand this. So but just in the most basic terms, if you could sort of educate me, what is that increase attributed to?
That increase is attributed to additional exports to south of Delta storage partners of sites project.
Okay, and I understand that. And why is there the ability to export an additional amount of water?
There would be identified available capacity through the pumping facilities to do so, to be able to export that water south of Delta.
Okay, but I mean, is that because there's an increase in runoff, or why is there additional water available for export south of Delta?
Well, it would be water that is released from the South Delta participant sub-account of Sites Project for those who, are storage partners and invested in the project.
I understand that, but it is an increase from, the 96,000 acre feet on a 221,000 acre feet. I understand why they would be allowed to or who it would go to, but what's the basis? Why is there an increase in water available for export south of Delta?
Because Sites Reservoir provides increased water supply.
Right, I understand that, but why does the number increase is what I'm getting at. Is it why in the ITP modeling and the assumptions is there additional water available for south of Delta export, if you know?
You mean relative to the final EIR model
Yes,
results?
exactly. Thank you.
right.
Yes, exactly.
Well, I, I guess one of the primary reasons would be that with reduced levels of reclamation participation, the storage like sub account for South Delta participants would be proportionally increased. So,
Okay.
so they have a larger sub account capacity now with the reduced reclamation participation, since the overall size of Sites Reservoir doesn't change.
Okay. Would that be the only reason for the increase relative to the final EIR?
Another component would just be with the future climate conditions. Sites Reservoir is able to divert more water due to the increased runoff.
Okay. And when you say 96,000 acre feet versus 121,000 acre feet over the long term, just what do you mean by the long term specifically?
That's the average annual volume increase over the 100-year simulation period of calcium. Sorry, the 82-year simulation period of calcium 2.
Okay, so then just to be clear, is it correct that the ITP modeling and the sites modeling both use the long-term aggregate averaging over this 82-year period? Is that right?
Right.
Okay. Paragraph 4 of your testimony, which is on page 3, I believe. We could look at that. You say at around line 6 that the ANN is used to determine the relationship between flow and salinity. And again, I have some understanding, I think, of what that means, but can you explain what that means? What does that mean?
There's water quality objectives that calcium operates to based on flow thresholds that are identified with different water quality objectives. So the ANN is used to establish what calcium flow objectives should be targeting in order to achieve water quality objectives. So this would be there's a few locations I think I covered in my previous testimony. So For example, these flow threshold water quality objectives are operated to at Collinsville, Jersey Point, Edmonton, I think Vernalis, and there may be a couple others that I mentioned in my previous testimony as well.
Okay. And when you say that you also say that the ANN was updated to account for the CT 35, the 15 centimeters of sea rise, correct?
Correct.
Okay. How does that update assumption affect the relationship between flow and salinity in the model?
I think generally it would require increased flow levels to account for the increased salinity levels in the future climate scenario.
Okay. Does the ANN have the ability to model the relationship between flow and salinity on a weekly or daily basis?
I am not sure.
Okay. You know who would know that on your team?
Yes, I think there's a couple people on my team that might know that. I'm not sure if there's anyone included.
On this panel, not on this panel.
Yeah, no one on this panel.
That's
yeah.
what I meant. That's okay.
Yeah.
So you're not sure. So the modeling done for sites, or particularly for the ITP, it doesn't at this point analyze weekly or daily salinity levels. It's all based on averages, correct?
Yes, in calcium, yeah.
All right. I want to go to paragraph 8 of your testimony. I think it's on page 7. You say in here that, let's see, around line 10 or 11, reclamation tends to use its share of the project storage more frequently and in greater volumes, right?
Mm-hmm.
What is that? What does that mean? Why I should strike that. I mean, why is that assumed in the model?
Basically because the primary objective of using reclamation's account is to preserve the cold water pool in Shasta. And so in the model, releases from sites CBP share are prioritized over releases from Shasta and Folsom, using a combination of weights and penalties in the model. So the model is releasing water from the site's CBP sub-account as often as possible so that the water can be preserved in Shasta as much as possible.
Okay. Does the model make any assumptions about how often reclamation will redivert sites water from the South Delta?
No. No. Once the water, there's like I said, there's these the model uses penalties and weights to try to release water from sites as much as possible from the CBP sub account, and then that allows for preservation of more water in Shasta. But when it's in Shasta, there's not like the model doesn't track what is done with that additional water that was preserved because of sites. It just basically becomes part of the whole availability of water in Shasta that can be used by reclamation.
Okay.
So when we in calcium, if we want to understand the effects that CVP OpFlex may have, we basically just have to do a comparison of like sites project rediversions versus the NAA rediversions. We don't explicitly track the site's water being rediverted.
You said it doesn't specifically track sites water that's rediverted. Is that what you said?
Yeah, not explicitly.
Okay. Does it track rediversion of sites water in some manner, it being the model?
We just to implicitly track that, we just have to do a difference between what the rediversions were in the sites alternative versus what they were in the no action alternative. But it's not a perfect comparison because like I said, it's not explicit tracking. It's more like just doing a overall comparison of alternative 3 versus NAA might be accounting for additional factors that aren't directly attributed to just the CVP account, since sites has an effect on the rest of the system as well.
Okay. I want to look at paragraph 9 of your testimony. On page 9. There you talk about the reclamation's participation at the 16% level of results in less Shasta carryover storage. And just so I'm clear, it's probably overly simplified for you, but why is that?
Because there's less ability to make releases to preserve more water in Shasta storage.
Because of the reduced. Go ahead.
Yeah, there's just a reduced water level of supply that that reclamation has to store in Shasta using sites water.
Is there anything in the ITP modeling or modeling results that you've looked at that provides any information or output concerning water levels in the South Delta as compared to the modeling for the final EIR?
I think we do have that internally. I'm not sure if that was released anywhere publicly. I'd have to check on that.
Okay. What do you mean you have it internally? What does that mean?
I know that my team modeled stages in the Delta region, similarly to how what was presented for the final EIR. I'm not sure if that was made publicly available anywhere.
Well, can you find out, and if it hasn't been made publicly available, can you make it publicly available?
Yeah, I mean, after checking in with the site's authority, but I could definitely check on that.
All right. I want to ask you just a couple of questions with respect to the operations ITP, which is, I think it's sites 298.
Do you want us to bring that up, sites 298?
I think so. Yeah, I'll bring it. Actually, it's just going to be one question about off of one page, so it won't be
No
too
problem.
difficult. Just if we could go to page 4. Towards the under project description, it sort of breaks it down into 7 components, and 6 it says permittee releases up to 637,000 acre-feet annually for downstream and south of Delta participants, etc. Are you familiar with that? Well, I guess I know you didn't write the ITP, but does that number seem correct to you? I mean, is there ability to release 637,000 acre feet annually? If you know?
Yeah, I think so. I think that number would have come from the maximum annual calcium result. So I don't think it would be a representation of like the maximum capacity of release. It would just be the maximum identified release that was made over the 82-year simulation period.
But would there be a difference between that and what the actual capacity for releasing is?
Yes.
And you know what that difference would be?
Not offhand.
And do you have an understanding of how much of that water, that 637,000 acre feet, do you have any understanding of how that's allocated? In other words, how much of that would be released for export versus other purposes?
No, for that specific year, I'm not sure.
Well, it just says annually, not for a specific year.
Well, that would be that number would have been arrived at in a specific year, which so we could like go back and check how much water was allocated to each participant based on that year where the 637 was arrived at.
Okay. But it is your understanding there's a difference between what could be released, I guess, model release versus the capacity for release, correct?
Right.
Okay. I don't have any other questions for Mr. Whittington.
Thank you, Mr. Reese. And just to clarify, does this conclude your cross-examination of this panel 3?
It does.
Wonderful, thank you. Ms. Meserve, do you have questions for panel 3?
Good morning, OSHA Meserve for San Joaquin County. Yes, I just have a few questions.
Please.
I have a few questions for Mr. Whittington and then a couple for Dr. Greenwood. Just staying with Mr. Whittington, since you're already up and running. Let's see, if your testimony discusses the releases into YOLO bypass, and I don't need the testimony, I don't think, because I'm going to move to a different topic, but thank you, Ms. Mueller. And I was wondering, with respect to the releases to YOLO bypass that you modeled, did you consider the portion that sites intends to divert into the Colusa Basin drain to go into the YOLO bypass for the Proposition 1 flows?
Yes.
Okay. And with respect to the Colusa Basin drain releases, did your modeling consider the capacity of the Colusa Basin drain to take 1,000 CFS during the August through October time period?
Yes.
And did you find any limitations from that investigation into the capacity to take the 1,000 CFS?
There may have been. I can't answer that with complete certainty.
Is there anything in your testimony that points to that I could look at to understand what you assumed for that component of the YOLO Basin, by the YOLO portion of the releases?
No, I didn't get into the details in my testimony.
So did your modeling assume that there was always 1,000 CFS available?
And bag is available where?
Well, the Colusa Basin drain is used as a drain for the agricultural area there. And so there, especially during growing season, there would be drain water in there. So when I mention capacity, what I mean, Mr. Whittington, is, you know, room for additional water that would be conveyed for purposes of the Yolo Basin, Yolo bypass releases that the project plans.
Objection misstates testimony and lacks foundation.
Well, let's try that. And I also didn't hear a question. Ms. Meserve, can we go back and try the question? I think I understand where you're going, and I would like to hear a response to this.
Mr. Ferguson said it was vague, so I tried to explain
Right.
what capacity meant. I could ask Ms. Mueller maybe to bring up an exhibit that maybe would help get at what the question is.
Great.
If you could please bring up SDWA 84 and go to page 20 of that report. Or well, maybe just stop on the first page first. Sorry, I didn't send an email about this in advance.
Okay.
This here, Mr. Whittington, is a memo prepared by Jacobs Engineering in 2020 regarding Colusa Basin drains. Are you familiar with this?
I haven't read through this.
If we could please go to page 20, there's a table that, and maybe zoom in a little bit if you don't mind. Thanks. So, Mr. Whittington, when I mentioned my question about considering capacity of the drain, it relates to information in this table, which appears to indicate that there's little capacity in the drain during certain months that the releases were planned for the Prop 1 benefits. Did you consider this information in your analysis?
I don't know if this, I don't know how this table would have been used in the model. Yeah, I'm trying to think. I don't think like the model has a static monthly representation for the flows going in, the non-sites water flows going in. But I mean, the model would consider that it can only use whatever capacity is available based on non-sites water flows.
But sitting here today, you can't tell me what those assumptions were.
No.
Okay, just to summarize, you testified that the model doesn't assume that there's always 1,000 CFS capacity in the Colusa Basin drain for these releases, but you don't know what it assumed?
Well, I would say that it assumes up to 1,000 CFS capacity.
Like between 0 and 1,000?
Well, yes, that's what I mean.
Okay. I guess maybe it's my misunderstanding of a model, but I thought there needed to be inputs. Wouldn't there be inputs or assumptions made about capacity to come up with the overall numbers and percentages that are included in your testimony that we're looking at today?
Well, the 1000 CFS would be the maximum capacity. And then there'd be a range in order to consider additional flows that are non-sites release water.
So, yeah, so you're acknowledging there may not be 1000 CFS capacity at all times.
Yeah, like
Right.
so the model it's set up in these different cycles or layers, and sites operation, so like flows are simulated without sites reservoir being in place in the model in the first couple of layers or so. And then and this is just for the simulation of a single month. And then at some point the site's operations are turned on, and it'll look at what capacity is available for sites releases once we get to that layer where sites operations are turned on.
Okay. So those assumptions are within the model that are, can you point me to where I should look to see where those assumptions are in the, what you've referred to as the first couple of layers?
Yeah, I could dig something up for you, of course.
Okay, thanks.
Mhm.
We can take that down, Ms. Mueller, thank you.
And it's Ms. Mullen, just,
Oh, sorry.
okay.
Mueller.
She does such good work, we will acknowledge her.
Yes. Let's see, so, just going to paragraph 15, Mr. Whittington, of your testimony, you identify there would be less flows in the Yolo bypass overall as a result of the project, correct?
Yes.
And that would be primarily as a result of the diversions off the Sacramento River to the north.
Yeah, primarily when sites diversions would be taking excess runoff that in which some of it would have been would have went on to spilling into the Yellow Bypass.
And did you, or the modeling indicate like on a monthly basis when those flows would be reduced?
Yeah, that would primarily occur in, I guess, January through March. That's where you would see the biggest reduction of wet year types.
And did you attempt to do any modeling around how much that would interfere with the other plans going forward to increase flows into the Yolo bypass that are separate from the sites project?
Objection vague and lacks foundation.
Are you aware of the state and federal biological opinions that require flows into the Yolo bypass of the state and federal water projects through the Fremont Weir, for instance?
Yes.
Did you specifically look at how the reductions in flows that you modeled would impact those projects or permit conditions?
Well, so we only used one baseline or one set of I guess, modeling assumptions and regulatory conditions that were included in the no action alternative. And so all of our results just present a comparison to that baseline. And so all the baseline assumptions, which should include any assumptions related to yellow bypass flows, would be included in the modeling appendices of either the final EIR or the ITP.
So just so I understand, it assumes that like for instance, the improvements to Fremont Weir are made by the entities that were doing that for the biops.
Could you please be more specific with which improvements you're talking about?
I think I better move on because I did not prepare properly for this angle of the questioning, but I think I got enough info to for now, Mr. Whittington. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Couple questions for Dr. Greenwood. In your testimony, you talk about the conditions in the ITP that address far-field effects on salmonids. One of the conditions you mentioned is the condition 922, which is the timing of releases to YOLO bypass, which are the August through October. Are you familiar with the capacity of the Colusa Basin drain to accept these releases?
I'm not greatly familiar with that, no.
So you haven't considered in your testimony on the ITP whether the releases would be possible due to physical constraints?
I've been sort of reliant on the different modeling information of the type that Mr. Whittington was just discussing.
The condition, are you familiar with condition 927 that discusses the condition of not releasing water at night's landing to Yellow Bypass if via Wallace Weir if salmon are present at Wallace Weir Fish Protection Facility?
I'm familiar with it.
Is there a reason you didn't mention that condition in your testimony?
I'd have to double check whether I mentioned it or not.
I can point you to paragraph 13 discusses kind of going into page 8 of your testimony, discusses many of the conditions.
Yes, could we just to refresh my memory, could we look at 927 again? Or could we look at 927 in the ITP?
Oh, certainly. So that's going to be sites 298. And page 54, please, Ms. Mullen.
Yeah, I'm not recalling any reason why I didn't mention it. Certainly it's there. It's part of the requirements.
How, looking at how sites would implement this condition, how will sites know whether fish are present at Wallace Weir?
I think there is a at the rescue facility there is activities that are undertaken, to essentially rescue salvage fish that approach there. So that would be, I think, use of that facility. As it notes there would be a monitoring plan, presumably using data collected on observations of fish or rescues of fish. And then, I think presumably, and this would obviously have to be developed moving forward, but, relating that to see whether, for example, numbers of fish that are observed at the rescue facility, whether those appear to be related to flows or flow increases, and then obviously apportioning that to if that's specifically related to the project or if that's something that's otherwise occurring. So trying to get at really the intention of that condition.
How do you think they would determine whether it was because of the project or something else?
Well, I think there'll be, as I understand it, there'll be a monitoring of, or I guess essentially recording of flows that are being released as a result of the project. For example, from the reservoir in this case toward the Yolo bypass. So then, to the extent that's known, then it can be presumably apportioned out what portion of the flow that might be observed in the areas hypothesized to be potentially attracting salmonids. How much of that then is related to the project versus other sources?
And what happens to fish if they follow flows up to Wallace Weir from Yolo bypass?
I believe these are, if they're reaching that rescue facility, then they would be essentially salvaged, rescued, and then I think they're, if I recall correctly, then returned to the Sacramento River.
Do you know what percentage of those fish survive that are collected?
I'm trying to remember if we had some of that in our materials, like our ITP application. I'm not recalling. I do recall that generally the numbers of fish, the data indicate that the numbers of fish are relatively limited compared to the overall number of fish moving up the system, for example, mostly in the Sacramento River.
Do some of the fish get impinged at the weir when they're attracted to it by flows?
Potentially so. I would say it may be dependent. I don't think that would be something that would be common for larger fish, but it could be something that might occur for smaller fish.
Do you know, Wallace Weir is staffed by Department of Fish and Wildlife, is that correct?
You mean the rescue facility?
Oh, correct, yes.
I believe so.
Do you know what months the Wallace Weir collection facility is operated currently?
I don't recall the specific months.
So are you unsure, do you know whether there would be staff there at the times that sites proposes to release water into the Knights Landing Ridge Cut that would go to this facility?
I'm not sure whether there would be staff. Well, I'm not sure. The condition there does talk about additional operations being or staff costs being funded if needed. So I'm not recalling the specific time period currently that staff are there. I would assume it's coinciding generally with perhaps a somewhat later period relative to that August 1 to October 31. Presumably more overlap with the kind of late summer fall period relevant to, for example, fall run Chinook salmon, but I'm not remembering specifics.
And so right now, at least, are you aware of a plan about how the communication would occur that would prevent sites from releasing water when there are salmon present at the fish protection facility?
Sorry, can you repeat the first part? Was it aware of a plan, sorry, or communication?
I was just going back, Dr. Greenwood, to the condition, and it says that releases won't be done to Knights Landing Ridge Cut if adult salmons are present. And I was just asking whether you know how that communication would occur.
I don't specifically know.
Okay, that's all the questions I had. Thanks.
Thank you, Ms. Meserve. Mr. King, do you have questions for this panel?
Yes, I do.
Please go ahead.
Mr. Weddington, thank you for your time. Can you restate what you told Ms. Meserve about flows in the Inclusive Basin Drain from January and March? Did you say they were going to be reduced in your model?
Yeah, sites project would cause a reduction in weir spills in wet years in those months.
And why is that?
Diverting excess runoff that in which some of it would have gone on to spill into the yellow bypass.
Where's that runoff? Which creeks or does that runoff come from?
Any runoff that's upstream of the diversion intakes, upstream of Red Bluff or Hamilton City.
Oh, but I'm talking about an Inclusive Basin Drain. Does your model assume any reduction in flows from the Inclusive Basin Drain?
Oh, I don't believe so. Sorry, that's not what I was specifying. I meant total flows into the yellow bypass.
Okay, great. Miss Mullen, can you bring up the sites 300? And, are you familiar with this exhibit, Mr. Winton?
Um, I think I've had a glance through it.
Okay. Um, it's the operations effect, I guess, the effects analysis. Can we go to page 22 then? Have you reviewed this page regarding the modeling uncertainty, Mr. Winnington?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. Can we scroll down to the second bullet point? Um, it says that the calcium simulation period is 1922 to 2003. Is that the same period that you're using for your modeling?
Yes.
Okay. And so if the Davis Weir bladder dam was, if the Davis Weir was modified in 2010, where there was a bladder dam and flows have changed in 2010, that's not included in your model then. Is that correct?
Objection lacks foundation.
Okay.
Let me, well, I can understand the question. Well, maybe. Well, Mr. King, if you want to try again and maybe ask it as a hypothetical or about future conditions,
Okay.
I'll let you give it a
So,
shot.
right. So I guess we'll come back to this. So let's go to exhibit King 69 to establish foundation. I guess scroll down that. Well, first of all, this is Mr. Whittington. This is a presentation that MBK, who's a consultant for Sites Authority. Scroll up a little bit, I guess, to see if we can see anything here. The managers group presentation to several individuals relation to the Colusa Basin drain on August 4th, 2023. So scroll down. Keep on scrolling. Keep on scrolling. And I'm just trying to establish the modification, the Davis Weir foundation. Keep on scrolling, Ms. Mullen. Thank you. Please keep on going. Okay, here we go. Keep on going. Yeah. Keep on going. You've got to go past, let's see. I'm trying to find the part where it talks about the modification of the Davis Weir. Keep on going. Thank you. Keep on going. Okay, here we go. This is I'm sorry for the side part, but
Hold on, Mr. King. Let's pause a moment.
okay.
Ms. Mullen's very good, but she can only do so many things.
Thank you. Okay.
There we go.
Go
Great.
up a little bit. So this is something that was prepared by MBK. It's and it talks about the historic operations of the Davis Weir. And it says, Mr. Winnington, it's operated by GCID, and that's Glen Close Irrigation District. And around 2010, GCID upgraded to a bladder dam. Do you see that, Mr. Winnington?
Yep.
2010, and it maintains water levels upstream, so it acts like a dam, and it eliminates leakage that occurred.
So, Mr. King, this is not the time to testify. I think we can all see the slide.
Okay.
What is your
But
question?
so this is 2010. My established foundation, if the Davis Weir was modified around 2010, any changes in flows coming from the Davis Weir down to the Knights Landing Ridge Cut would not be included in your model. Is that correct?
Yeah, I just want to clarify. So the 82 years assumes 82, it's 82 years of hydrology that considers consistent regulatory conditions and existing levels of facilities. It's not, it doesn't, like, facility assumptions are not modified every year of the simulation period. So it's not a historic model. So that's just one clarification. And then, so like the model, even if it did extend through 2020, it wouldn't have like an option where once you hit 2010, operations of the Davis Weir changes would be implemented.
Okay, so if flows substantially materially changed after 2010 in the Davis Weir for certain months, the model would not include that. Is that correct?
The model is used to evaluate compare two different scenarios over 82 years of different hydrology assumptions.
Okay. So then let's go back to sites 300, page 22. Thank you, Ms. Molina. Okay, if we could go down to the fourth bullet point, Mr. Winnington. Do you believe this is a correct description of the limitations, the modeling of the limitations of the calcium 2 model, and can you read that paragraph and let me know if you believe that is a true statement? And bullet point number 4.
I would agree that yeah, the representation of the Colusa Basin is simplified, and it is one limitation is the coarseness of the model. So there's for example not an actual operation of Funk's Reservoir. There's just a node that water passes through to get to sites.
It doesn't in my reading, it doesn't seem to include any of the natural flows from the 17 or I think or more tributary, the ephemeral streams into the Colusa Basin. There's no mention of that. Would you agree that that's also not included in the model?
No, yeah, there's just as the bullet says, it lacks complete detail. So there are several small streams or creeks that are not included in the schematic of calcium in this area.
Do you think some creeks are and some aren't? Is that correct?
Yes, it's not comprehensive of everything in the region, though.
Do you know the total annual average flows that you are assuming from these creeks in the model?
Not offhand.
Okay, is about 380,000. Does that sound about right? 380,000 acre feet?
Yeah, I don't have this knowledge offhand.
Okay.
Apologies.
Now, are you aware that the operations of the sites, proposed operation sites, assumes that water could back up 13 miles from the intersection of the Dunnigan Pipeline and the Colusa Basin Drain to Balsam Dam? Are you aware of that?
What do you mean by backup?
Well, that there, as water enters into the Colusa Basin drain, those flows may back up, as the elevation rises, the flows will back to the north and have reverse flows depending on what flows are coming, depending on the month. Are you aware of that?
Uh, the model does not consider reverse flow in that way.
Okay. And does the model include any of the elevation differentials in the Colusa Basin drain within 6 miles north and south of the intersection of Bird Creek of the Dunnigan pipeline?
Calcium doesn't do that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Wennington. That's all my questions for. So my next question is for Dr. Greenwood. And if we could stay with sites 300. Dr. Greenwood, you're familiar with sites 300, is that correct?
Yes, I'm familiar with it.
Okay, can we go to page 161, please? And you scroll down just a little bit. Dr. Greenwood, can you see this is section 4.133 talking about metals and metalloids? Are you familiar with that?
I believe I've read it. Yes.
Okay. And then Ms. Mullen, can we scroll to the next page, table 413? Dr. Greenwood, do you see any reference to chromium, trivalent form of chromium or hexavalent form of chromium in this table, which was considered for the ITP?
Could you scroll down? Is there any more on the following page?
Yeah, there is a few, just a nickel. Has nickel, but not chromium.
Sorry, which were the metals you were referring to?
Chromium, either in the trivalent form or the hexavalent form.
I didn't see reference to those in that table.
Now, are you aware that there is some reference to hexavalent chromium in the EIR?
I don't recall offhand.
Okay. Do you have any idea why chromium is not one of the metals considered here for the ITP?
I'm not sure. This was prepared by CDFW.
Okay. Are you aware that hexavalent form of chromium can be toxic to freshwater fish?
I'm not specifically aware.
Okay. Can we bring up King 82? Is this Dr. Greenwood, are you familiar with this research about the exotoxicology of hexavalent chromium in freshwater fish?
I don't believe I've read this, no.
Okay. If there was chromium in the Colusa Basin drain from naturally occurring chromium, would that be something that the CDFW should consider or monitor?
Objection calls for speculation.
Okay.
Uh,
Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead, Mr. King. I mean, you can rephrase that question if you
Um,
want. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm trying to figure that how, does the CDFW,
Well, Mr. King, I think you might be better off here to ask Dr. Greenwood about his opinion as an expert rather than CDFW's opinion, which he
okay,
would not be
great,
privy to.
great. Well, Dr. Greenwood, is hexavalent form of chromium, is it adverse to any of the covered species for the ITP?
I'm sorry.
Dr. Greenwood, are we having a technical difficulty? Do you need the question again?
Yeah, sorry. I got just the very first part of the question, and my internet connection seemed to drop off.
No, no
Right.
problem. Mr. King, please.
Yes. Is the contamination by a hexavalent form of chromium adverse to any of the covered species of the ITP?
Objection, vague and overbroad.
Dr. Greenwood, have you considered, have you ever in your work, have you considered the adverse effects of hexavalent chromium regarding the covered species of ITP?
I haven't specifically considered
Okay.
hexavalent chromium.
Okay. Can we bring up a King Exhibit 80?
Excuse me, hearing officer Kenzie, by my calculation, it looks as though Mr. King is approaching or maybe has already reached his time limitation that was set in your limits for cross-examination for this portion. So I wanted to raise that. I know there was a point made earlier in the proceeding on this, but I just want to make sure that we're holding people all to the same rules.
Thank you. I'll look to my team, and I think they're working on it on an update on timing. And how much, Mr. King, how much longer do you think you have for this panel?
10 minutes, 5 to 10 minutes.
Okay.
And just Mr. Greenwood, Dr. Greenwood, I'm sorry. So can I go forward?
Yeah, go ahead. I think we may have, and I appreciate your point on this, but let's go ahead and go forward and see if we can get through this.
Okay. So, Dr. Greenwood, do you have a familiarity with the natural sources of contaminant of hexavalent chromium in California?
I don't have really.
Okay. Do you know that weathered serpentine rock actually is a source of chromium?
I don't specifically have that knowledge.
Are you aware that there is a lot of weathered there is a lot of serpentine rock within the drainage area of the Colusa Basin Drain?
I wasn't aware of that.
Okay, great. And so my last, Ms. Mullen, can you bring up King 81? Dr. Greenwood, if you could just go, we got to introduce this. Could you scroll down a little bit, Ms. Mullen? Dr. Greenwood, can you see that this report is titled The Colusa Basin Drainage Area, Fluvial Sediments Dynamics, Environmental Impacts, and Recommendations for Future Monitoring of the Colusa Basin Drain Suspended Sediment Project? Can you see that?
I see it.
Do you have any familiarity with this report, this research?
I don't believe I've read it.
Okay, it's you can see it's out of the UC Davis research, right? Is that correct?
I see that.
And so you don't have any knowledge about the recommendations, or do you have any knowledge about the recommendations of this report?
I do not.
And do you have any knowledge of the environmental impacts that are described in this report?
I don't believe so. Actually, looking at this report, I may have looked at this report at one time as I look at it again, but I'm not recalling specifically.
Yeah.
I'm not recalling specifically what the environmental impacts were that they discussed.
Okay. Yeah, and so my last question regards sites exhibit 115C2, Dr. Ms. Mullen. It's testimony of Dr. Huber. Sites 115C2, page 25. Yes, and just from a point of foundation, Dr. Greenwood, if you refer down to the third sentence, it says hexavalent. This is the title of this section is if you, Dr. Greenwood, will you agree that the title of this section is management of metals other than mercury? Is that a correct reading of the subtitle?
That's correct.
Yeah. And then the third sentence says hexavalent chromium will also be measured at least for the first year due to limited existing data for the Sacramento River. Is that correct?
It says that, yes.
Okay. And it doesn't mention anything from the Colusa Basin drain. It just says Sacramento River.
Objection.
Uh,
If
Okay.
you're talking about that sentence, or are you talking about
Just that
anywhere exhibit?
just that sentence.
Mr. King,
I'm done. That's my last question. No,
well, did we get an answer to the question?
I don't
I
know.
didn't hear an answer. So what was your question,
yeah.
Mr. King?
Well, let's just maybe if he could read the whole that like, how long is that section?
Why? So, but Mr. King, it's not
Okay.
necessary to read for the witness to read the
You
testimony.
know,
But I mean,
it's I don't need it. I just want to make the foundation that about hexavalent chromium. So I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. King. I will look to my team. Well, maybe we'll do this when we come back. We are due for a break, and I'll give you an update, Mr. King. I believe you're right at time, according at least to our internal calculation, which may, there are maybe slight differences. But I realize we have one more witness, so we can work through that when we get to that point. I would like to go ahead and take a 20-minute break so that I can confer with my team about possibly some questions for this panel of witnesses. So let's go ahead. It's 10:29. Let's reconvene at 10:50 and we'll pick up. I may have some questions for this panel. So I'll see you in 20 minutes approximately. Thank you. Welcome back. I will turn to Ms. Cott. Are you ready for us to go back on the record?
I'm all set, thank you.
Thank you. And I will wait for all of us to, all the witnesses to get their cameras on. And I actually didn't have, I believe I saw Dr. Greenwood was in the waiting room, but I don't have questions for Dr. Greenwood. So I think we can go ahead. There we are. We can go ahead and get started. These are not, it's not a lot, but thank you for your patience and thank you for giving us we had a little conference here. I have a question for Mr. Whittington. And this is, I think, is a fairly basic question about operation of the sub-accounts. It's not really specific to the ITP testimony, but my understanding is that Reclamation's 16% interest, if you will, is equivalent to 230,000 acre feet in Sites Reservoir. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah,
And
up to 230.
up to. And my understanding of how these sub-accounts work is that Reclamation can store in sites up to 230,000 acre feet and then could request that some of that water be released, which would mean that there was some vacancy, and then possibly refill to up to 230,000 acre feet in the same year. Is that accurate?
Well, yeah, within the same year. Typically, releases would be occurring in the summertime, and then the refill would coincide in the winter afterwards. But yeah, it is possible for a release to be made, and then for sites to also fill some of that water back up within the same calendar year as well.
And just to, I'm trying to state this again because thank you. That I think I'm understanding, which is this 230,000 acre feet is storage space as opposed to a diversion limit within 1 year. Is that one way to
Yes.
characterize it? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
That's very helpful. Somewhat basic, but I wanted to make sure I was understanding that. And then we had a question with respect to the 2035 CT selected for the ITP. And I think this is a question for you, Mr. Whittington, which is, do you know why the 2035 CT was selected for inclusion in the ITP application?
Yeah, so when these models were developed, sometime starting around, or like development of the modeling commenced sometime around 2021, I think. And so at that time, there was interest in modeling a future condition that somewhat overlapped with the ITP period, which would expire, I think, at the end of 2039. And so there was a 2035 CT climate data set available for calcium 2 modeling that was used for the California Department of Water Resources in their 2020 environmental impact report for long-term operations of the SWP. And so the decision was made to use that same data set.
Thank you. And do you know why 2035 CT was not included in the final environmental impact report analysis?
No, I can't think of, I can't recall the answer to that right now.
That's fair enough. Thank you.
Yep.
And then I believe this last question is for Dr. Wilder. As I recall, and I tried to go back and look at the video, which is a little difficult sometimes. On cross-examination by Mr. Busher, and I don't mean to misstate your testimony, so please correct me, but my understanding is that there was an exchange in which Mr. Busher asked about differences and conclusions of impacts on species by CDFW and the ITP, and your analysis in the case in chief testimony. And I believe you stated that CDFW's conclusions were based primarily on the impact of exchanges. Do you recall that testimony, or does that sound accurate to you?
Yeah, and I think what at the time my frame of mind, I mean, as you say it now, I could see how that would be different, but at the time my frame of mind was specifically on the analyses that I had conducted, primarily the temperature analyses. But there are certainly other mechanisms through which there were effects as determined by CDFW. And I believe those are, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, so sitting here today, the effects identified by CDFW, as you understand it, are not all associated with the exchanges.
Correct. Yeah, there are effects of impingement, downstream effects that may or may not be affected by exchanges. So certainly not limited to exchanges.
But can you explain so thank you for that. Can you explain to me, though, what the relationship is between exchanges specifically that might increase impacts on listed species?
As far as the hydrology, perhaps Mr. Whittington could better explain it, but in terms of impacts to fish, everything is related to flows and or water temperatures. So if the temperatures are higher, then there could be impacts to fish. If flows are lower or are different in some way, those could impact fish. And so I believe the exchanges cause changes in flows and temperatures that would result in those impacts.
Thank you. That's helpful. And Mr. Whittington, does that fit your understanding of how the relationship between the exchanges and impacts on species?
Yeah. So with the without or by removing the exchange operations from the model, there would be a change in Shasta and or Oroville storage levels, and a slight change in volume and frequency of releases from both of those reservoirs. So there would be there would be effects to river flows, and then consequently temperatures at different years and different months. So I think in the ITP, CDFW came to the conclusion that with it and with and without the exchanges, they saw flow decreases in certain times of years and for certain year types, and flow increases and temperature increases or decreases in different water year types. But the results were pretty similar relative to the no action for each of the site scenarios. At least that's my memory of what was concluded in the ITP.
Okay, thank you. All right, thank you so much. Those are the questions I have. So I will turn to Mr. Hitchings. Do you have redirect for these witnesses?
We do not have any redirect for this panel.
Great, that's efficient. Thank you then. Thank you very much to the three of you for joining us Monday and today, and I appreciate very much you taking the time to testify here, and you are excused. With that, I will look to Mr. Hitchings or Mr. Ferguson, or Ms. Chester, I don't know if she's here. Who should I look to introduce the final witness?
I'm going to be introducing Mr. Walker.
Thank you. And do we have Mr. Walker? Yes, we do. Great. Welcome, Mr. Walker. Thank you for joining us. I will go ahead and administer the oath, and then I will turn things over to you, Mr. Ferguson. Mr. Walker, if you would please raise your right hand. Do you swear or affirm under the penalty of perjury that the testimony you will give in this hearing will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you very much. Please proceed, Mr. Ferguson.
All right, before we get started, Mr. Walker, can you say hello again or something? I didn't really hear you when you just spoke there.
Okay, sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yes, great. Okay, excellent. All right, Mr. Walker, can you please state your full name for the record?
Wesley Walker?
And do you understand that you're providing your testimony today under oath?
I do, yes.
Is Exhibit Cites 311C a true and correct copy of your testimony in this portion of the proceeding?
It is, yes.
And did you prepare that written testimony?
I did.
And does your testimony in Cites 311C rely on certain exhibits that you've introduced in this part of the proceeding?
Yes.
And which exhibits are those?
Cites 334R and Cites 335.
Okay, great. And you were able to confirm that those exhibits are, as submitted, are true and correct copies of the documents you reference?
They are. Yep.
Great. Is Cites 336 a true and correct copy of your summary presentation of your testimony?
It is.
And did you prepare that summary presentation?
I did, yes.
Okay, great. Can you please go ahead and summarize your testimony using your presentation in Cites 336?
Yes. Yes, of course, if we could bring that up, please. Good morning, Hearing Officer Kenzie. My name is Wesley Walker, and today I'll be providing a summary of my supplemental written testimony. My testimony details the updated results of potential diversions by the Cites Reservoir project from the historical analysis, which was updated to implement the changed diversion criteria included in the operations ITP issued by CDFW. Next slide, please. The topics I will present today in the order in which I will proceed mirrors the organization of my written testimony. Next slide, please. I'll start with a brief summary overview of my testimony. First, the operations ITP includes different diversion criteria than the historical analysis. As a reminder, the historical analysis was developed to evaluate whether water is available for appropriation under historical conditions using stream gauge data and assuming diversions by downstream water right holders in an amount equal to the face value of their water rights, along with site-specific diversion criteria. As it relates to the operations ITP, the diversion criteria in the historical analysis was modified to include the diversion criteria in the operations ITP. Next slide, please. Next, we'll go through each of the revisions, the historical analysis, and the related water availability tool, starting with the changed diversion criteria. Next slide, please. The first change criteria is a change to the maximum diversion rates at each of the Cites project's Sacramento River points of diversion, consistent with conditions 9.5 and 9.6 in the operations ITP. These conditions set limits of 2,120 CFS at the TCC point of diversion and 20,070 CFS at the GCID point of diversion. The historical analysis had previously assumed limits of 2,200 CFS and 2,000 CFS at each point of diversion, respectively. Each of these modifications result in a change to potential diversions of approximately 1%. Next slide, please. The next change diversion criteria is the incorporation of the flow-dependent diversion requirements at the TCC and GCID points of diversion, consistent with condition 9.14. These requirements specify the maximum rate of diversion at each point of diversion relative to the observed flow at the corresponding reference gauge location. Diversions at flow rates between those in the tables included in condition 9.14 are determined through linear interpolation. This condition replaces the Bend-Bridge pulse protection criteria previously included in the historical analysis. Relative to other diversion criteria included in the operations ITP, the flow-dependent diversion requirements become the dominant control on potential diversions, limiting the rate of potential diversions on approximately 80% of possible diversion days. Next slide, please. The next change diversion criteria is a modification to the Wilkins-Loop bypass flow criteria to be consistent with condition 9.12. This condition now requires a minimum flow of 10,930 CFS at the Wilkins-Loop gauge at any time the site's project is diverting from the Sacramento River. The historical analysis previously assumed the minimum flow requirement was 10,700 CFS from October through June and 5,000 CFS in September. The Wilkins-Loop bypass flow criteria was previously the dominant control on potential diversions, but now only limits potential diversions on approximately 5% of possible diversion days. Next slide, please. The final change diversion criteria is a modification of the criteria related to delta excess conditions, consistent with condition 9.8. This condition, or this prevents diversions from occurring until the delta is in an excess condition and the daily net delta outflow index, or NDOI, exceeds the daily NDOI on the last day the delta was in a balance condition by 3,000 CFS. The historical analysis previously assumed the delta had to be in an excess condition for 7 consecutive days before diversions could begin. This change has a nominal effect on the frequency and volumes of potential diversions. Next slide, please. Excuse me. We also made 2 other revisions to the historical analysis in the corresponding historical water availability spreadsheet tool. These 2 changes are not directly related to the operations ITP. The first change was to modify the availability and diversion calculations to account for travel time. These assumptions include 1 day of travel time between the TCC and GCID point of diversions, 1 day from the GCID point of diversion to Wilkins-Slough, 1 day from Wilkins-Slough to Verona and Freeport, and 1 day from Freeport to the South Delta exports and Delta outflow. These travel time assumptions were made to be consistent with the assumptions included in the Term 91 and Coordinated Operations or COA accounting calculations developed by the Bureau of Reclamation and DWR. The historical analysis previously did not account for travel time. These changes to incorporate travel time also had a nominal effect on the frequency and volumes of potential diversions. Next slide, please. The other revision to the historical analysis was to extend the period of record through September 30th, 2024, thus adding 3 years to the analysis, as the period of record in the historical analysis previously ended on September 30th, 2021. The addition of these 3 years has some effect on the historical analysis's summary statistics, given that water year 2022 had fairly minimal diversions, but water years 2023 and 2024 saw relatively high potential diversions. Next slide, please. Before we move to the results, I'd like to note the historical analysis developed and presented in my prior testimony was also updated with the same revisions to the historical water availability tool, namely the addition of travel time and the extended period of analysis. As such, any comparison to results from the historical analysis that were previously presented may show some minor differences. Additionally, moving forward, any reference to the previously completed historical analysis will simply be referred to as the historical analysis, while any reference to the updated historical analysis with the ITP diversion criteria will be referred to as the ITP historical analysis. I'll reiterate so it is 100% clear. The historical analysis and the ITP historical analysis are analyzed using the same historical water availability tool and include the same global assumptions. The only difference between the two analyses are the ITP diversion criteria previously discussed. Next slide, please. And one other note before we move on to the results, my supplemental testimony only presents the results of potential diversions calculated in the historical water availability tool with the ITP diversion criteria, rather than including the full range of water availability results. This is because the diversion criteria in the operations ITP govern operations of the sites project as currently proposed. The flow-dependent diversion requirements do not allow for a calculation of water availability of water available for appropriation when Sacramento River flows are greater than the flows that corresponded to the maximum diversion rates in the operations ITP. As such, it is only possible to update the potential diversions calculated in the historical water availability tool, not the entire range of water availability calculations. That being said, although we are not presenting the full range of water availability results, demonstrating that water is available for diversion also demonstrates that water is available for appropriation. Next slide, please. This slide presents summary results of potential diversions for the ITP historical analysis. It is organized in the same fashion as results presented in my prior testimony, but I will step through the table to reorient everyone. The table provides results for each of the sites project Sacramento River points of diversion and for this total combined. The second column indicates the annual frequency of diversions, which is 84% of years in the historical analysis at the TCC point of diversion and 80% of years at the GCID point of diversion. The third column provides the annual average potential diversion, which is 144,000 acre-feet at the TCC point of diversion, 110,000 acre-feet at the GCID point of diversion, for a combined total of 255,000 acre-feet. The fourth column provides the maximum annual potential diversion, which is 635,000 acre-feet at the TCC point of diversion, 484,000 acre-feet at the GCID point of diversion, and an annual total of 1,115,000 acre-feet. You'll note that the annual maximum at each point of diversion come from different years, and thus the sum of the TCC and GCID point of diversion annual maximums do not exactly equal the total combined. The final column indicates the months with potential diversions, which is December through June at both points of diversion. As previously noted, these potential diversions demonstrate that water is available for appropriation by the sites project. Next slide, please. This slide presents the differences between the summary results for the ITP historical analysis and the historical analysis. As a reminder, the only differences between these two analyses are the diversion criteria assumptions. In the interest of time, I'll only focus on the last row in the table, which shows the differences between the two analyses for these summary results. In the second column, you'll see there's no change to the annual frequency of potential diversions. In the third column, you'll see there's a 49,000 acre-foot change to the annual average potential diversion. In the fourth column, you'll see a 104,000 acre-foot change to the maximum annual potential diversion. And in the last column, you'll note there's no change to the months in which potential diversions can occur. I'll pause briefly for folks to review this. Next slide, please. Overall, the diversion criteria in the operations ITP result in less water available to divert on some days, which are largely driven by the flow-dependent diversion requirements. There is no change to the annual frequency of potential diversions and only minor changes to the daily frequency of diversions. Specifically, over the 25 years included in the ITP historical analysis, there is a net increase of 31 potential diversion days. This is demonstrated in Table 10 of the ITP historical analysis memo, submitted in support of my supplemental written testimony as sites 334R. These 31 days represent an average of approximately one additional potential diversion day per year and an increase of approximately 2.5% of cumulative diversion days over the period of analysis. Given this relatively small change in diversion days, the difference in the potential diversion volumes result almost entirely from a change to the rate at which diversions are allowed to occur on some days, not a change to the number of days when diversions can occur. Next slide, please. I'll end with an update to the table that we have previously presented. Next slide, please. Please note the information and results provided here are the same as presented in my prior testimony, except that the ITP historical analysis replaces the results previously presented for the historical analysis. As shown through the results presented in my supplemental testimony, the ITP historical analysis demonstrates that water is available for appropriation by the sites project. Additionally, when viewed collectively with the other analyses developed by the Sites Authority, water is both available for appropriation by the sites project and unappropriated water is available to supply the sites project. That concludes the summary of my supplemental written testimony. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Walker. With that, I will turn first to the coordinating NGO parties. I'm not sure who would like to go first, but do you have questions for Mr. Walker? Mr. Busher.
We do. I'm happy to get started. I think Mr.
Great.
Schutz has questions as well. Good morning, Mr. Walker.
Good morning.
I think we met a few months back. I'm Eric Bush. I'm the managing attorney at San Francisco Baykeeper. Thank you for your time here. Today, I've got a few questions for you. I just want to make sure I understood your testimony and written testimony as well correctly. When you looked at that table at the end that had the 6 different historical analyses, or the 6 different analyses in it, the only one that's changed at all for your testimony is the historical analysis, right?
That's correct. Yep.
Okay. And those other 5, including the CalSim 2 Alt4 analysis, those remain the same as you presented them in August and then when you last testified.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. So for those other 5 analyses, aside from the historical analysis, did any of those include diversion criteria proposed by sites in the ITP application?
To the degree that they may have changed with the finalized ITP, yes, but in terms of any new or changed criteria, I would say no.
So I'm sorry, let me make sure I understand. For the work you did before the ITP was published by Fish and Wildlife, the historical analysis included the diversion criteria that sites had proposed in that application, correct?
Correct, yeah.
Did any of the other analyses, the 5 others, include the diversion criteria that were proposed by sites?
Yes, it included the same diversion criteria that was in the prior historical analysis.
Okay. And despite the fact that those diversion criteria changed, you only updated the historical analysis, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Did you do any work or analysis as to how the changed diversion criteria impact those other 5 analyses that were not updated in your testimony?
We did not.
Is it your opinion that the change in diversion criteria between the application and the final incidental take permit would have no impact on your analyses in those other 5 models?
No, I wouldn't say that. There certainly would be some changes, but I wouldn't want to speculate as to what kind of changes or what degree those changes might be.
But you agree that you would expect to see changes in the outcome of those other 5 analyses based on the changes in the diversion criteria. You just haven't done that work, so you don't know what those changes in outcomes would be. Is that correct?
Objection asked and answered.
I think it's fair. Go ahead, Mr. Busher.
I think it's very likely, but I can't say 100% yes, 100% no.
How come you didn't update the other 5 if it is very likely that it would have changed results?
So there's no point to update the face value analysis because that does not include any diversion criteria. So the results of that would not change. As it relates to any of the calcium 2 analyses, we don't have an updated calcium 2 model that we could have run those analyses. And I think to your the last point of your question, the changes to the historical analysis, I think give us a pretty good sense of what we might see. So, it provides us a good answer to that question.
Are you working on any updates to calcium 3 analysis with respect to the sites project?
I myself am not, no.
Are you familiar with the work that is occurring with respect to that work, that analysis?
I know it's occurring, but I couldn't give you any more detail beyond that.
I take it from your prior answer, is it fair to say that your expectation is that the changes would be similar in direction, at least in the other analyses, as you found in the historical analysis, the updated historical analysis?
Objection vague and calls for speculation and asked and answered. He said it would be different. You're asking him to go further, and he said he hasn't done the analysis and couldn't speculate on that.
So, I mean, I'm happy to respond. The witness just said, one of the reasons that the calcium 2 analysis was not done is that the information from the historical analysis gave a pretty good indication for what that updated calcium 2 analysis would likely show. My question is just, does that mean that his opinion is that, right, we would see similar direction, right, overall reduction in water available under the updated calcium 2 analysis if that had been performed?
And I think that's a fair question, so I'll allow the question, Mr. Walker.
Could you repeat the question again, please?
The updated historical analysis shows an overall reduction in the amount of water potentially available for diversion, correct?
Yes.
Had the calcium 2 analysis been updated with the new diversion criteria, do you expect it would show a decrease in water available for diversion as well?
It's very likely it would, but to what degree or what magnitude, I could not speak to that.
Thank you. Ms. Mullen, could we please put Exhibit 311, Mr. Walker's testimony, on the screen? If we could turn to page 7, table 2, please. Okay. Mr. Walker, this was the same table that was in the last slide of your presentation, correct?
Yes.
Okay. The headers for the first, well, there's 2 headers here: annual frequency of potential diversions and annual average potential diversion. Do you see those?
Yes.
In your prior testimony, the headers for those columns were annual frequency of water availability and annual average water available. Is there any difference in your mind between those terms? Does that change signify anything?
As it relates to the frequency, I'd say no. As it relates to the annual average water availability and potential diversion, there is, but potential diversions are essentially just a subset of the total volume of availability.
Okay, so can you explain to me the difference or what that means, that the annual average potential diversion and the relationship, I guess, between annual average potential diversion and annual average water available, as you had used those 2 terms in these tables?
Sure. So the annual average potential diversion is the portion of total water available that could physically be diverted, based off of diversion capacity, things like that. I think, as I said in my presentation and my testimony, because of some of the way that the ITP criteria is provided, we weren't able to provide the updated availability calculations because it's not as clean or clear as maybe it was with the prior diversion criteria. Hence why we only provided potential diversions this time around.
Can we scroll up just a little bit, please, Ms. Mullen, so we can see table 1 as well? All right. So I'm sorry, Mr. Walker, if I'm just being dense here. Table 1 here, when it refers to the historical analysis, shows 304,000 acre feet as the annual average potential diversion, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then can we pull up Mr. Walker's prior presentation? It cites 276. And if we could go to the page 29, the last page of the document. So here the historical analysis annual average potential diversion is 287,000 acre feet, correct?
Yes.
And the annual available average water available is 749,000 acre feet, correct?
Yes.
And I guess, can you try and explain to me why the historical analysis shows different numbers in this summary as it does in table 1?
Sure. So the different numbers, I think I said on, on slide 11, when I was talking about slide 11 from my presentation today. So we extended the historical water availability tool to include 3 years, right? And then we also made those adjustments to travel time. The travel time adjustments had a very, very small changes to the results of the analysis, but the addition of those 3 most recent years, especially with the 2023 and 2024 being pretty wet with pretty high diversions, produced a change to the annual average results and some of these other summary statistics like frequency.
Okay. So I think that helps a lot. Am I correct then in understanding that when you were describing what you're calling the historical analysis in your updated testimony that includes the ITP analysis as well, that historical analysis is different in those 2 respects, right? Than the historical analysis you presented previously?
Correct. Yeah.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.
All the assumptions and everything are the same. It's other than travel time and then the extended period of analysis. But the extended period analysis is really what drives the changes of these summary statistics.
That makes the 287,000 acre feet increase to 304,000 acre feet in the updated. Okay.
Yep.
All right. Thank you. We can take this slide down, or this older presentation down. Oh, in your presentation this morning, you indicated with respect to the change for delta excess conditions in the delta, that it had a nominal effect on the frequency and volume of diversions?
Correct.
Which direction did that nominal effect point, right? Is it higher frequency, higher volume, lower volume?
I think in terms of volume, it was almost neutral. In terms of frequency, it was a handful of additional days. But you know, those days are either at the very end or I shouldn't say, they're at the very beginning, you know, of diversion events. So usually on those days, you know, other criteria are controlling or there's not a ton of water available to be diverted on those type of days.
So about the same amount of water, slightly more frequent diversions by the change in the delta excess condition.
Yes, yeah.
Okay. And then the same question, you described the changes in the travel time as having a nominal effect. Can you describe which way that nominal effect points?
Sure. In terms of the frequency, I'd say the same thing. You know, it adds a day here or there. And in terms of the volume, it was maybe a 1% increase at the most, but I think it might actually have been a little bit less than that. I don't have that number fresh in my mind, but it was incredibly small.
So very small effects, but increases in both the number of diversions and the total volume of diversion.
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. And could we pull up exhibit 334, sites 334, please?
I just might note, Mr. Busher, this was revised, so I don't know what, we just want to make sure you have the right memo.
Yeah, 334R.
Okay, great.
Great, thank you. All right. Mr. Walker, did you prepare this document?
I did.
Can we start at page 2? There's a section here, updates to the historical analysis, that includes, does that section include all of the updates and changes that were made?
Yes.
Continues basically through page 6. Okay, thank you. If we scroll down to the bottom of page 2, you say the flow dependent diversion requirements were incorporated to the historical analysis and replaced the pulse protection criteria. Did you do any analysis where the flow dependent diversion requirements was layered on top of the pulse protection criteria?
I did not.
Mm-hmm. And then at the bottom of the page there in footnote 2, oh, I already asked that. Never mind. I'm good. Sorry. Smolin, could we scroll to page 6, please? Mr. Walker, for the Wilkins Slough bypass flow criteria, is it correct that that condition 9.12 now applies September through June throughout the entire season of diversion?
That's my understanding, yes.
And that's how you used it in your model or implemented it in your model? Okay.
Mm.
Thank you. And then with respect to the net delta outflow index, this section here, and then there's a kind of explanatory footnote 3 at the bottom. Does the analysis you performed include actual CFS rates for delta outflow?
Yes, we use the net delta outflow that's available from Dayflow.
Okay. And did you perform any analysis as to how often the delta is defined in excess conditions where net delta outflow is less than 42,000 CFS?
No.
Based on your familiarity with the model, do you have any estimation for how often the delta is in excess conditions, but not delta outflow is below 42,000 CFS?
Not off the top of my head. I'd have to look. Sorry.
And when you say look, would that be, what would you look at or use in terms of the information to answer that question?
I think basically what you just said, you look at the net delta outflow and the data available for that and the data available for excess and balance conditions.
Yeah, fair enough. I didn't ask a very good question. Is that in Exhibit 335 or some other document that you have submitted to as part of this proceeding? The ability to answer that question?
Yeah, the data is available there. Yes.
In 335?
Yes.
The travel times that are defined here, there's a footnote 4 that says it comes from, well, it says they were developed to approximate those used by the Bureau and DWR. Is that the travel times that come from CDFW's DRAT, D-R-A-T tool?
No, they're to some degree different than what's in there.
Can you describe the differences in the travel times that you used and the travel times contained within that DRAT tool? Or that the DRAT tool uses?
Because I can't say that I studied to a great degree what was in the DRAT, but we're working off of a daily model, so we wanted to keep it on a daily basis. What's in the DRAT model, my understanding is has some relation to hydraulic routing equations that are consistent with the Upper Sacramento River daily operations model, the USR DOM. And then another reason that we kind of moved away from that was, I believe those calculations only go through Tisdale Weir or Knight's Landing or thereabouts. So it didn't give us kind of the full gamut from the points of diversions through the delta.
Thank you. Do you have any understanding of whether the travel times you used, right, the 4 different one-day periods that are described there, are substantially different than the travel times that come out of the DRAT tool, at least as far as the DRAT tool extends?
I don't believe that they are. I think at most there may be, and for some of these locations, half a day or maybe a day at the most different.
Okay, thank you. If we could scroll down so we could see the next section, the extended period of analysis at the bottom of this page. Thank you, Ms. Mullen. Mr. Walker, you talked about a little bit earlier in the 3rd paragraph here says that the differences under the updated historical analysis and ITP historical analysis are largely a result of extending the analysis to include the recent 3 years. That's 22, 23, and 24. Is that correct?
Correct.
Did you do any analysis of the conditions in the ITP that did not include those last 3 years?
I mean, I think we looked at it, but obviously nothing has been submitted, and I can't necessarily remember it off the top of my head what that might have looked like.
Okay. The extended period of analysis, am I correct in understanding that it increased the amount of water potentially available for diversion in the modeling?
On an annual average basis, yes. Yeah.
Okay. And why was the decision made to include the last 3 years to update the time period?
Well, I think anytime we can add additional data to an analysis, it just makes our answer, our analysis that much better. And I think, generally speaking, we've had folks ask for those additional years, what those might look like. And, again, I think the more years or more periods that we can reference, it just gives everyone a better reference point and a better answer of what things might look like.
Was there any update of the time period covered in any of the other 5 analyses?
There wasn't. I mean, the calcium 2 is I think you're familiar, uses the 1922 to 2003 period, and then the face value uses the unimpaired flow data set that's available for 1922 to 2014.
And can you tell me when the historical analysis data set starts?
January 1, 2000 to September 30th, 2024.
You've added 3 years to a 20-year record is what the effect of this is, correct?
We added 3
21-year
years to a 22-year period, correct.
Okay. We could go to the next page, the top of page 7, 334R, please. Thank you. So you mentioned this during your opening, and I see it here as well. The second sentence says the flow-dependent diversion requirements do not allow for a calculation of water available for appropriation when Sacramento River flows are greater than the flows that correspond to the maximum diversion rates in the ITP. Can you unpack that and explain that for me? I don't follow that sentence.
Sure. So specifically the flow dependent diversion requirements, which I believe is that condition 9.14. The tables that detail those requirements, which are conditions 9.14.1 and 9.14.2, those only have those different step and diversion, or excuse me, flow and diversion levels up to the diversion capacity limitations in the ITP. So above that flow, we couldn't say, well, can we take everything above those flow and call that available, or does the kind of linear trend that makes up the flow levels in those tables, does that continue, or can we not take any flow above the diversion level? So there was a lot of open questions related to that. So that's why we kind of steered away from providing an updated, total volume of water that might be available. With the historical analysis previously, the diversion criteria were a bit more of an on-off switch, or, kind of a bottom end threshold. And we could make an assumption, that everything above this level was available. With the flow dependent diversion requirements, it's not really possible to do that.
So maybe it'd be helpful if we scroll up to page 5. So figures 1 and 2 on this page, and then yeah, the figures on this page, these are the graphs for the flow dependent diversion criteria, correct?
Yes.
And am I correct in understanding that what you're saying is like, right, where the blue line ends at 12%, you didn't feel like you had any further guidance as to what to do from there, whether that should level out and be horizontal or continue at the same slope, so you just stopped where the blue line ended?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. Do you have an understanding for, in terms of the flow that would be diverted under these graphs, or consistent with these graphs? Does that blue line end roughly where the capacity, like the physical capacity to divert, ends?
They're very close, or should say not necessarily maybe the physical capacity, but the capacity that the authority is requested. It's very close to the.
So the flow dependent diversion criteria restricts the authority's diversions within the capacity that the authority has requested to be able to divert. Is that fair?
Yeah, I think generally, yeah. Yeah, I would agree.
Okay. And so can you then explain to me why, well, is that portion of the flow dependent criteria up to where these lines end incorporated into a determination of whether water is available in the updated historical analysis?
It is, yeah, and that's kind of why I said so. We only were able to do the potential diversions because we're kind of capped out at the, like you said, the end of these lines. So we only are providing the potential diversions, but I think, like I said a couple of times in my presentation, showing that there's potential diversions shows that there's water available for appropriation.
In updating your analysis, did you make any determinations as to specifically whether there is water available for appropriation when the Sacramento flows are below, right below that, for the blue line below 18,000 in this case, right, would fall on this graph?
So we divert up to the limits allowed in these lines here.
Yeah, I'm sorry, and I'm just trying to understand, right? You say because of the limitations or the ambiguity within the flow dependent diversion criteria as to what happens after this graph ends, that requirement does not allow for a calculation of water available for appropriation. And I just want to know, right, up until that graph ends, did you perform an analysis of whether there is water available for appropriation based on this criteria?
Yes, again, that's what our potential diversions are, and showing potential diversions is a showing of water available for appropriation.
And the following, oh, I'm sorry, if we could scroll back down to page 7. The next sentence after, in the first paragraph after what we were just talking about, that starts with "as such," right? The updates that you're describing, that's what we just discussed in terms of where that graph ends. Is that right?
I believe, yeah, yes, that's correct.
Okay, thank you. In the second paragraph in this section, the looks like second sentence starting in the middle of the third line there starts with the potential diversion results. And you made this point in your opening as well. This is hypothetical, not what actually would be diverted in any of these water years. Have you done an analysis of what could have been diverted, right, given the other constraints that would be imposed in terms of space in the reservoir, et cetera?
I myself have not, no.
Are you familiar with whether that analysis has been performed?
I'm not. I mean, essentially, that's what the calcium analysis was being used, is it includes all the kind of other operating constraints and operations of the rest of the system.
And that calcium analysis has not been updated either for the water availability modeling or otherwise to include the criteria in the ITP itself, correct?
Correct.
Can you describe for me what the other operational constraints are that you just referred to and that are in the fifth line of that middle paragraph?
Sure. I'd say that's mostly, or maybe even entirely, what else may be going on in the TCC or the GCID points of diversion, whether TC is diverting their own water into the Tame-Maclusa Canal, or likewise GCID is operating there as well. There's also, some wintertime maintenance and cleaning of the canals that, could potentially limit or prevent diversions at some point in the future.
Okay, thank you. If we could scroll down to page 9, please. And at the bottom of this page, underneath figure 5, and then with the footnote, the maximum potential diversion that you found in 2006 and 2017 in those 2 water years exceeded the condition of approval 9.4 cap, correct?
Correct.
Was 9.4 that condition incorporated into the model to show that water above 986,000 acre feet in a year is not available for diversion to Sites Authority?
It was not.
Would reducing the diversions in those 2 water years down to the cap have impacted the annual available water to divert?
A small amount. Yes, I can't say off the top of my head how much, but it would have been fairly small. The 2006 number, I think, is in the next table, table 6. That's not, it's maybe 130 or 140,000 acre feet more. And the 2017 year was barely above the 986. I don't have the number off the top of my head. So you're really only talking about the reduction of 1 year, and how that that would have resulted in a fairly small change to the annual average number.
Is there a reason that that condition was not included in the modeling?
We talked about it, I think, as this was kind of a overarching constraint, and we're intending to or show the maximum water, for our showing of water available for preparation. We kept to leave it out, but obviously we made this note here. And I'll, not to get too far into the weeds, but these numbers here are based off of the limitations that, or not the limitations from the modeling, but the results of the modeling. So it wasn't necessarily, it was kind of based off of, CDFW could permit up to that number because that was the number that came out of the calcium modeling.
Would there have been days at the end of either water years 2006, end of the diversion season for water years 2006 or 2017, where the cap would have prevented diversions from occurring?
Yes, I think short answer, yes.
And are those reductions in days included in any of the analysis that you've presented?
They're not, no.
Okay. If we could scroll to page 10, please. Before I jump in here, Ms. Kenzie, I've probably got, I don't know, 10 minutes or so left. I'm happy to finish or break for lunch whenever you would prefer.
Let's go ahead. If you have,
Wonderful.
if you can finish, I think we should push forward. So please go ahead.
All right, I appreciate that. Thank you. So, Mr. Walker, figure 5 is the potential amount of water that the authority could have diverted in water years 2000 through 2024, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And we look at 2002 and 2013, those are both dry years with diversions, correct?
Yes.
Or potential for diversions, I suppose, more accurately.
Correct.
Okay. And water year 2015 is a critical year with potential for diversion, according to the analysis, correct?
Correct.
And water year 2017 is a wet year with substantial diversions, correct? That's the second highest one on record.
Correct.
We could scroll down to page 18, please. And on the bottom half of this page, this is a hydrograph for water year 2002, correct?
Ms. Mullen, would you scroll down a little bit, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, the bottom half of the page. Thank you.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. So my first question, the flow rates for Bend Bridge and Wilkins Slough in this table and the others for the other water years that you've provided, are those before any diversions by sites? Or does the Wilkins Slough number account for sites diversions?
No, those are the raw historical gauge data.
Okay. And then if we look at the diversions here and compare them to the Wilkins Slough flow, and am I correct in reading this that the diversions that happen kind of after January 12th happen at a time when Wilkins Slough flow is less than 24,000 CFS?
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
And if we could then scroll to page 24 and look at water year 2013 at the top here. So again, this was a dry year overall, correct?
The final water year type was a dry year, correct?
Correct. Okay. Do you know whether the diversions that are reflected here between, I don't know, call it December 1 and December 10 or 12 maybe, whether those diversions would have occurred if the pulse flow protection had been in place?
I can't say exactly. I'll say it does look like kind of the type of event that would have triggered that, but I need to look back at the analysis, or I need some more other information to confirm that.
Okay. The same question for the December 22 through, I don't know, January 1 period. Would that also have been controlled by the pulse flow protection?
It may have, but again, I need some other information. I'm not sure that the criteria would have reset at that point. And if it had not reset, then there would not have been a pulse protection event.
Okay. And then the last question I have just about these tables overall, the green bar at the top is like an on-off switch. Yes, delta is in excess if there's a green bar. No, it's not if there isn't.
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. And is there associated CFS flow rates for the delta in this? Is it the same information you were relying on that we talked about earlier?
Yeah, I mean it's not included in these figures, but it's in the spreadsheet, yes.
And then if we could go to page 26, please. And here, look at water year 2017 at the top. This was the second wettest year on record, correct?
Second, you mean second by
It-
second,
it-
second highest potential version? Yes, correct.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that. And in that 23-year window, not the 1922 forward window, correct?
Correct. Right.
All right. Am I correct in, well, the same question about the diversions in mid-December. Do you know whether those would have occurred with the pulse flow protection in place? The
If
10th
you
through the 20th, basically.
say, it kind of looks like that there's that short window there where the delta is not in an excess condition, but there's a spike in flow. There may have been a pulse event at that time. So then by the time the delta did go into an excess condition, you may have been past it. But, again, I need some more information or have to look back at the analysis to confirm.
Fair enough. And then if we look at the end of this year, from, roughly March 9 through April 4th, I'm sorry, through May 4th, the rest of that diversion period, those are diversions occurring when flow at Wilkins Slough is less than 24,000 CFS generally, correct?
Yeah, for most of that period.
We could scroll back up to page 14. So the end of the, we can scroll down below the table to the paragraph there. You see the changed diversion criteria generally reduce potential diversions. Is that a volumetric measure in that first sentence?
Yes.
Okay. And you say then a couple sentences later, the cumulative number of diversion days nominally increases under the ITP historical analysis, almost entirely due to removal of the bend bridge pulse protection criteria. And those are those periods that I asked you about where the pulse protection may have prevented a diversion in December, for example, in those water years that is allowed under the flow dependent diversion criteria. Is that correct?
If that was an example, then yes, that's what this statement would have been referring to.
Okay. And if we could then scroll down to the top of page 15. Like, correct in understanding that there are no times your analysis showed in this record where water was potentially available for diversion by the authority in September, October, or November.
That's correct. My analysis is not, but as my colleague Ms. Bizone will be presenting as part of the rebuttal portion of this, this past year, November 2024, there would have been the potential for the project to divert at the end of November.
I will ask her about that in the next couple of weeks, I assume. I'm sorry, last question, or last two questions. If we go to page 12 of this document. And at the above table 7, you describe the relative differences in the historical analysis being greatest in the dry years. Do you see that?
Yeah. Excuse me. Yes.
And is that specific to the Tehamacalusa Canal point of diversion?
Correct.
Okay. And then in below the table here, there's a paragraph for the GCID point of diversion. If we scroll down, please. A little bit farther. Awesome, thank you. And for that point of diversion, the relative differences, you describe them as greatest in above normal, below normal, and dry water year types. Is the proportional impact equal in each of those 3 water year types? Or the relative difference, I guess.
Proportional, do you mean in terms of the kind of the relative, like the percentage based, or do you mean the explicit volume?
Yeah, so I apologize. You say the relative difference is greatest in those 3 water year types. I typically take greatest to mean the one biggest, and I'm trying to decide if these 3 are equal or if they were, about the same and there's no impact in the others, to how we ended up with 3 greatest.
Sure, fair question. Ms. Mullen, if you wouldn't mind scrolling down to that table 8 there. I believe, if my memory serves me correctly, that it was stated as such because the relative difference is pretty similar for those 3 water year types.
Okay. Whereas it's for the other point of diversion, the dry years stand out alone, at least more clearly.
Yeah, and looking at the volumes, I think that's the correct way to look at it.
That's all the questions I have for Mr. Walker. Thank you very much, Mr. Walker. I appreciate your time.
Yep, no problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Busher. Thank you, Mr. Walker. It is 12:08. I think what I'll do, it's a good time for a lunch break. I'm aware of, I think giving us a little longer lunch break, we have the time, and that may help. It'll help me take a look at the exhibits that came in and give us time to do that. So I'd like to go ahead and take a break starting now, and we will return at 1:20. And we can pick up, I think we may want to start with a brief procedural exchange, and I apologize to keep you, Mr. Walker, through that, but I think it would be helpful to have an exchange about rebuttal in case there's anything I want to think about over a break, and then pick up again with Mr. Walker. So with that, please do log out of the Zoom, and I will see all of you. Oh, is there anything else we should talk about before we break for lunch? You can ask that of the room. All right, great.